Talking about Jupiter in Scorpio and the great lesson of forgiveness. That's going to be the biggest lesson for the next year. It's a great opportunity to forgive those who have hurt you. So check this out. So I'm talking about Jupiter in Scorpio for the next year or so, from October 2018 until around November of 2019. And this is more about the personal spiritual growth opportunity of Jupiter in Scorpio. I made an earlier video that talked more about the culture, politics, certain advances that we may see in the world and certain challenges in the world, but this is more on a personal level and the great spiritual opportunity that you have with Jupiter going through Scorpio. Now, first, we want to understand that, Jupiter takes those qualities of teachings and our guru and our, literally the philosophies that lead us to a higher place in our life. That's what Jupiter is, and it goes into different sectors of the sky, different astrology signs, and then those signs fall in different houses from our rising sign, which really determines a focal point of growth and, in the case of Jupiter, of spiritual purpose and putting your teachings into practice. It'll show that for the next year, specifically based on that house from the Ascendant. Like for Aries, Scorpio is the 8th house. For Taurus, it's the 7th house. For Gemini, it's the 6th house, etc. So I am doing a full video for all 12 signs, Jupiter in Scorpio for all 12 signs based on these houses in my member site. You can get that only 50 cents. You also get daily forecasts and other things, so you can check that out. But in this video, I'm talking about the Jupiter in Scorpio and what we're all going to be experiencing with Jupiter as it goes through Scorpio, aside from whichever house that is for you. Now, Scorpio is literally the sign where we feel the pain, the emotional pain and fear and vulnerability from our past wounds and those who have wounded us and who have hurt us, and whether they intended it or not. We can get very emotionally attached to those wounds and to those who have wounded us as a matter of survival. Because Scorpio is a tamasic sign, which is first motivated towards survival and making sure we stay alive. So there's a reason why those people that hurt us and those experiences that hurt us, not just people, but experiences as well, are hardwired right to the reptile brain. Because, certain things are dangerous, but especially when we sense a person who has lied to us or who might be able to manipulate us, we become hyper aware that they might do it again. So we bring out that, that assumption or that projection, that sort of dark projection onto that person. As soon as they disappoint us or hurt us, we might start to expect that they're always going to disappoint us or hurt us, even if that's not true. Again, this is the psychology of Scorpio. This is why we can be paranoid and obsessed about stress and worry with Scorpio, because it's literally that part of the brain that says, you hurt me once, you might do it again. Now I'm going to be suspicious of everything you do. And it's not even just of people, it's of situations where, for example, I remember, and again, this is why it can be very difficult with Scorpio. I remember when I trusted this person and my trust got me lied to and got me exposed, and I was vulnerable, so I'm never going to be vulnerable again. Right? So it can go even really far. And Scorpio is the sign where that's the potential, where that vulnerability and that desire to be protected from things getting out of control and situations where when we give over control because of our love, especially because it's a water sign, where we lovingly and innocently trust, and we see how that can be painful. Again, whether the person intended it or not, we have to be aware of this with Scorpio, because all of our loved ones hurt us. Even just the pain of love hurting is also Scorpio. And just how love can be painful, and that can make us vulnerable, so we need to be careful. Even if nobody hurt us. But again, and again, we always have to, back up and realize people can hurt us unintentionally. And again, even people hurting us makes us a victim. Again, this is the thing that Scorpio energy always needs to be careful of, is I'm the victim. Is I didn't, and now because I'm a victim, I need to protect not just myself, but everyone else from the potential victimization. And again, this can get a little crazy, because often you'll see when Scorpio is in that kind of spiraling mode, they will jump up and push back against someone who, in their mind, has perpetrated something against them. And they'll do it often under the guise of, well, I need to protect everybody from you. This righteousness justifies, this justification for being triggered, and for, well, it's not just me, I need to protect others from you, or protect others from this situation. And again, it's also in the positive. You will see, this is why Scorpio people who have a lot of planets in Scorpio, particularly like someone has their Ascendant there, or they have several planets there, this is the strong motivator for them, because they've felt the pain of being vulnerable and of not being strong. It's almost in many ways their life's mission and purpose to protect others from emotional pain and to help others transform that pain into strength, which is also the great strength of Scorpio. And what I'm going to talk about in this video is some of my family history and my transformation around forgiveness with my parents and with my upbringing. Without getting so deeply into it, there's quite a lot to deal with, as we all have had a story. We all have a story. But the greatness of Scorpio is that it's the part of us where we're willing to stay engaged and to courageously transform. But the real thing to understand, like I said at the beginning, the key to actual transformation is forgiveness, which allows us to be vulnerable and to be compassionate, and to have the courage to be compassionate rather than protective. When we're just trying to protect ourselves and others, there's that aggression of Mars there, which is not compassionate. Mars is not the compassionate planet. You see, all the planets don't do everything. Mars and Saturn aren't what you would call compassionate. They can lead to it. Everything can lead to compassion. But when Mars gets activated, it's not activated to be compassionate. It's activated to be protective and to be disciplined and focused. It's just a different energy. The compassion, however, of Scorpio comes from the emotional courage that Mars gives. Then what happens is, once we're courageous and powerful, then it opens up the portal into our compassion, which has more to do with the moon and Jupiter especially. So Jupiter has to do, again, with our teachers and the lessons that we learn and the healing that comes as a result. And again, it leads to forgiveness and understanding and gratitude for higher teachings. And again, when it moves into Scorpio, it's that gratitude and that understanding that allows us to transform this emotional vulnerability and this pain. We have to be careful of bypassing and all of that, which I'll talk about in a minute. But, first I want to explain, and talk about a little bit of my story, because it helps people to understand not just me, because that's not really what's important, but to, you know, bond and feel the, how my story is your story, basically, because everyone has difficulty with their parents, with their upbringing, with things in life. And we all have had something that we've needed to forgive, and we've had a story where we felt vulnerable and where we've had this temptation to collapse around some protective, well, I'm never going to let anything hurt me again. But then we're cutting off the flow of life and the flow of love. And so, how do we transform, especially with the family? I'm going to talk about like the family connection. So, I did a recent video where I talked about, how, my childhood was pretty hard in the sense that, my father was very smart, and he was, funny and whatnot, but he also came from a certain era where I think he was married when he was 23 years old. My mother, by the time she was 20, she had 2 kids and a man who was, abusive. This was at a time when a lot of men, hit their wives and certainly hit their sons. I was born in 1963. So being raised at a time when most boys were hit, were beat, sometimes badly, but women were smacked around, and men, that's the way, sort of just the way it was. In this day and age, we look back on those times and people that maybe acted that way as being these terrible monsters. Growing up at that time, especially when culture began to evaluate these things a little bit more, was a godsend. It was a real blessing. And but what happened is, growing up this way, I had a lot of anger toward my father, for sure. I didn't see him from the time I was like 16 until I was about 21, I think. I didn't see him at all. I had visitation rights. It was mandated by the court, but we almost got into a fist fight when I was 15 or 16. I don't actually remember the year. And then I just said, I don't want to come over anymore. And he was like, okay, I don't want you to come over anymore. And then again, I didn't see him for 5 or 6 years. And again, that was actually quite a blessing. My mother understood me very well and knew enough to leave me alone at that point, because I was becoming quite rebellious and reckless and smoking pot and being I was out of control in that sense. At a certain point, it was like, well, there's not really much we're going to do with him. So let's just hope he gets through all this or whatever. And so I was allowed to not have to go over, because it was like they could have said, no, you're going over to see your father. And that would have been quite a disaster. We'd have probably been in fistfights, and who knows what else could have maybe happened at that time. But what happened is I got into meditation when I was 19, deep meditation. It happened immediately. As soon as I learned to meditate, first time I ever really tried it, it was like, okay, bam, like just everything was put into perspective instantly. And all of that anger and frustration, I would say all of it dissipated. It's not like it dissipated, but what happened was I saw things in perspective. The thing is, I spoke about this a little bit in the last video where I talked somewhat personally about myself, and I was talking about how we're all programmed differently based on our psychology and our incarnation and our karma. Myself as a Gemini, I've always had this kind of desire for freedom and autonomy and not really controllable or whatever. And I've always been that way. It frustrated my parents, frustrated, everybody to some extent, because you can't really control Gemini, especially if they have a lot of Gemini. They want to do what they want and they want to be free. As long as you let them be free, they're fine. They're great. And people like them. on the other hand, how I always experienced it, even when I was younger, I didn't hate I really didn't hate my father. I loved my father, and I still love my father, and I loved my father then. I loved my mother. My relationship with my mother was even a little more confusing. Um, I'll talk about that maybe in a second. But with my father, even through all of that, I didn't hate him by any means. I loved him. I didn't like him very much, but I just didn't understand the circumstances. When you're young and you're, 14 or 15 and you've grown up with this man who was, nasty to you at times, very selfish and narcissistic. This was my father's problem, and it lasted his whole life. I'll talk about that in a second. But when I was younger, and you just don't understand the world, you don't understand the complexity and the subtlety of someone being mean, yet you love them, you see them being mean to your mother, mean to you, you don't hate them, but you just don't trust them. Again, this is all that Scorpio energy, the stuff I talked about at the beginning. That's why I'm talking about this, not just because I want to tell you, but it's this whole thing we have. Love hurts. Love, which is water and vulnerability and all the things that require us to love, is painful. And which is the Scorpio, it's the awareness of how painful love is. That's literally what Scorpio is. That love is painful and it hurts, and we need to be careful and protect ourselves. And especially when you're younger, you don't have any skills yet. You haven't learned enough. You haven't had enough lessons. You haven't done enough. So as soon as I got any perspective or any situation that gave me some objectivity, which is what the meditation did, then I was able to come back to center very easily. And what I did is just one day just showed up at my father's house. I just showed up, hey, how's it going? And there was literally no anger. There was just like, hey, how you doing? And my relationship with him and my mother at that point was very different. It was basically like adults. I wasn't really their child. Frankly, I never felt like their child. This is another thing about my incarnation, is I've always felt very outside, very alien. Like I'm just tolerating this crazy childhood existence. I don't know what this is. I don't know who these people are or what all this stuff is. And I know that I have to find myself through my own identity, because none of this is who I really am. And I always knew it. But when you're in the situation and you're a child, you don't have any freedom. You don't have any autonomy. Again, you can see it in my chart because it's all those planets in the first, especially with Rahu also there, and Ketu in the seventh, which shows that all these people, and not even just, but it persists, that nobody can define me. So here's something you can know about Rahu in the first also, is that the person must define themselves. Nothing another person can say will ever be satisfactory as far as being defined. It's always going to feel off. And so that was always the case. And so what happened is, once I found that self that was deeper than my identity in relation to this family and this and that and this and that, once I connected to that through stillness and silence and meditation, there was no attachment anymore. There's no attachment to the story and what you did and all that. It just, of course, it's still there. There's a lot, all of it is still there. I can still feel the pain if I remember certain things, especially certain painful things that happened when I was a child. It's still there. It never goes away. But what happens when you get perspective is forgiveness happens automatically when you connect to your true self. The first thing is, and especially it's through meditation. Again, I've said this before. I'd love to say there's another way. People don't like to hear this, but there isn't. At some point, your true self will only be revealed when you, I've said this before, kind of sit down and shut up and close your eyes and connect to that thing which is beyond this worldly identity. Now, there are all kinds of things that we can do to find ourselves in other levels and ways to cope, particularly other, remedies in Indian astrology and yoga and all of these things. But all they do is cycle back to a place where you can be calm and still and peaceful and have the truth of your nature revealed. And then you can experience that. I was a musician for a long time. I was doing all kinds of stuff. I still do. But those are things, those are tendencies that I have, and you have all these tendencies to do things, but you don't want to fool yourself that playing music or writing or doing this or doing that is going to unwind that self-awareness that truly brings the detachment from those things you're hanging on to. Because those things you're hanging on to will still be grabbing you until you grab a hold of your true self. And really what meditation is, and real and authentic stillness and silence and peace, and that true soul that you really are, there are no hooks in it. There's nothing from that other world that hooks down into that. It's just a whole different level. Again, now, so that doesn't mean that everything was rosy after that, because of course it's not. There's history and there's all this there. So when I showed up again at my father's and started and we never even talked about it, which is kind of the way I am. It's like, oh, hey, how's it going? Now here we are. We're just now being present, and you're this person and I'm this person, and we're encountering each other as adults. This is a big thing, because when we have this charge, especially around our family members, we still look at them as these like icons of my father, like this person who should have been a certain way or represent this other thing that's so much more important than every other flawed human being walking around. And it's not true. When you put people on these pedestals like that, or if you're looking at these family members, well, you were my sister, you were supposed to blah, blah, blah. Here it is, folks. This is where you're just cooperating with the illusion. This is another flawed human being just like you. You were my father, you were supposed to blah, blah. You were my mother, you were supposed to, and you hurt me. All of that dissipated. I saw them as flawed human beings just like me, and great compassion came for the good that they did. And I was deeply grateful, because I also realized, which I always did, that these were two people who, like I said, my father he was a smart, funny guy, but he was 23 years old with 2 kids and a wife he didn't love, probably, not knowing himself at all. I don't know how I would have reacted in that situation, probably worse. And so you can't have forgiveness without empathy. And I promise you that if you empathize with the people that you hate so much, or that you, especially family, if you try to put yourself in their shoes, it'll be very, very hard to hang on to all that. It's very hard. Again, and this is why Scorpio is the sign where we feel that. Like I can get choked up and emotional very easily, especially talking about these things. Because the feelings are always there, they're deep. And we have to be willing to feel those things. But they're also not, they're also not real, in the sense that the dispassion that you need in order to move beyond it, and the intelligence that you need to have forgiveness, doesn't come from that emotional attachment. It comes from being detached and looking at things objectively. This is the nature of Mercury. This is this great skill of Mercury, is Mercury sees things with neutrality and doesn't get all hooked into drama. And it's trying to understand things and to be fair and equal and even. And when Mercury is powerful, we see things equally, and we say, I think I would have done maybe even worse than you. And I appreciate what you did do. And I look like when I look at my father and my mother, you know, go back a go back a generation. Look at the people who raised your parents. Before you judge your parents so hard, look at who raised them. I look at my father, I could blame him for things, but I can't imagine what his childhood was like. Raised by his parents, again, because they were a product of their life, but they just come through the Great Depression. My grandfather was a hard man. My mother too, she was 7, 8 brothers and sisters. And, you know, these were people of modest expectations in life. They weren't educated, literally like in the backwoods of Maryland, basically, literally in like the woods where I grew up. These weren't people that understood, especially even at that time. So again, the point of the matter is, when you start to look at someone's life, though, you can really appreciate what they did. And one of the things that happened is and this was even back then, after all that charge and that pain was released, I felt a lot of appreciation for, you know, some of the real heroic acts that my father did do and that my mother did. You know, my father could have done things that were much worse. He, like many people, he lost control of his emotions. He lost emotional control. He didn't have any control over his psychology or understanding of his past, and he would lose it. And he would get violent and lash out, and that's how he was taught. In fact, that's how I was taught. I was taught that. And a big part of my struggle has been to not be that way. And by the way, I got those early lessons about being angry and violent and all of those things that you get filled with. I would say got out of my system or faced very early, where my early relationship, literally when I was like 21, like at that time, I was supposed to get married and all of these things, and I just got off the path. And I was with a woman, a young girl, who was want to subscribe, but even if you are subscribed, you want to click this little bell that says get notified about every new video. You want to click that, and then you will be notified, and it has the little ringer on after you do that. So make sure that who was abusive, who was like sort of daring me to like slap her around and all this stuff. She would follow me and like hit me and stuff, and I learned very early that I just don't have that in me. And I didn't know when I was younger. The biggest confusion I had being raised that way, and the confusion that we have when we're young, is we don't know ourselves. We don't know what we're capable of. And I learned very early that I wasn't capable of that. I've just never had that desire. I mean, literally to be like abusive in any physical way. All of us can be emotionally abusive with our words and our anger at times, sadly. I work on that every day. I think most of us have issues with that when we get our feelings hurt. But the point is that what happened is, once I got into the meditation and all of that, I really fulfilled a higher part of my destiny, which is very much in that sort of Gemini nature, to see them as equals, to see them as people that I interacted with, like I interact with everyone, even like girlfriends and all that. Good, friends, and where you see things in that way, where you're giving each other a break and you understand the other person's point of view, and you have compassion and empathy for what they've done, and you try to give them the benefit of the doubt and all of that. And there were some problems. They came up, at times when my father, especially with my father, where he would still lose it a little bit sometime. And I had my buttons, especially when he would want to sometimes start talking stuff about my mother. And I didn't want to hear it. And I would just be like, look, I don't want to hear that. And he would go there. And again, it would take nothing. He had a trigger temper. I mean, like, And so you still finish, you still go through the karma. And there was a couple times, I think there were maybe 2 or 3 blow-ups in about a decade. And every time they would happen, he would start to say something, and I would be like, look, I don't need to hear this. I don't need to hear your opinions about my mother. Okay, I heard enough of that stuff growing up. And it would just be out of the blue. I think he would just, I don't even really know why, because they didn't even have any interaction at that point. I think it was just to kind of tweak me or something. I don't know, just to get some frustration going with something. And as soon as I would say that, he would jump up and start screaming in my face. You goddamn bird, screaming in my face. And I would just get up and walk out while he's standing there screaming. And, he didn't like that so much. I'm laughing. It's funny, but some really funny things happened as a result. I mean, to me, and again, this is kind of a big part of my nature, is to find the humor in those things. And I found the humor in them then. And of course, that infuriates someone even more. I'm not trying to infuriate them. It's just funny. And, then there would be a break where he might blow up. And then again, I would just kind of disappear again. I wouldn't come around for 6 months or so. And then I'd show up again and just be like, hey, how's it going? Oh, hey, Sam. And then it's not even like we would talk about it. It's not even like you need to talk about it. It's just like, we know what happened. We don't need to talk about it. And you just go on. So again, I say that at times there can be some bypassing where you don't really work things out with the person. And that's definitely one of the things, for example, like that happens with Gemini, is not really wanting to get into all of that stuff. It's just, to some extent, I think everybody knows what's going on, but it's that uncomfortable phase for Gemini. This is why Scorpio is a difficult sign for Gemini. That Scorpio kind of energy to get in there and let's get in there and process all this emotion and what happened and get all our feelings all over the place. It's like, do we really need to? Again, this is why the sign of Scorpio for Gemini, which is about wanting to just, look, let's just move on. It's hard. This is why signs have these relationships with each other. So I'm using myself as an example. I'm talking about these stories so that maybe you can feel something in your life that's perhaps related. One of the things I also wanted to mention is, and I see this a lot, I saw this with my parents, is we need to grow up beyond our lineage. We need to delineate ourselves from our parents. How many people still live to try to satisfy their parents? The whole life they live still trying to make their father happy or their mother happy, or they're still these familial bloodline connections permeate the entire life. I saw both of my parents through the whole life still very much on one level trying to make their parents happy. My father, when he died, well, I don't know when he died because we weren't in contact when he died, but when his father died, there was just hatred between fathers and sons in my family. I broke that tradition. My grandfather hated his father. My father hated his father. I didn't hate my father. My father and I were friends. We actually became quite good friends. Then I moved away and it got hard for him, I guess. And then we just didn't really have a lot to talk about the last few years. But that trend was broke. And I know if my father walked in the room right now, it would be nothing but love. In the way we express it. And maybe others wouldn't understand it like that. Same way with my mother. But they understood their son. They understood me as being the way I am. Others might not. And in fact, this is one of the things that happened in that situation, is his ex-wife or my stepmother or others might not understand the dynamic, but they understood. And everything was good between us. But there was a distinction, like I said, very early. In fact, it happened when I was a child, where I was independent of them. And we have to be independent at some point. In my case, it was maybe too much so, because there was perhaps not as much bonding as there could have been or should have been. And that's a fair assessment as well. Because there was such harsh environment, I didn't bond so much with either one of them. They were both sketchy and scary on that level as far as to trust. They weren't trustworthy. I mean, it's not even a, it was a legitimate reaction. And both me and my sister had it. Both of us did. That it was hard to trust either of them. Doesn't mean there wasn't love and compassion and appreciation. You know, my mother taught me compassion because when I was young and I saw my father mistreating my mother and my father mistreated me, and I was 12 years old, 13 years old, fiery person that I was, why, I would hate him. I would talk about him and I would rage, and my mother wouldn't let me do it. She let me do it, but she would tell me, she would explain to me that, you know, your father loves you and you shouldn't hate your father. He does the best he can do. It's like heroic. And I was like, how can you say that? The way he's treated you and the stuff he said about you, most of the stuff that made me angry, the stuff that made me angry about my father was him talking about her. That's the stuff that made me angry. That's the stuff that made me so angry. Right? That was the button. That was always the button that got me in trouble. The stuff that would happen with me, I often just laughed. It was somewhat laughable. But what used to really get me in trouble or get me hit or have me mouthing off was when he would say stuff about my mother. And I would fight back and argue with him and tell him that was a lot of BS, even when I was a kid. That's the stuff that I would be railing against. And then she would tell me, you shouldn't say that about your father. Your father loves you and he does the best he can do. That's pretty heroic. And it's a great blessing to have gotten a mother like that for all her problems. And my father had his own ways of being that way also. There are things that he could have done, especially with our house that we lived in and other kinds of things, or he could have kicked us out of the house and disrupted our life in many other ways, and he didn't. He acted with a lot of heroism in his own way. And these aren't things that people were taught. They weren't taught to be that way. This is just the quality of their soul. And I appreciated that very early, once I got some dispassion from the whole thing. So again, I'm talking about this because Jupiter in Scorpio is really a time for trying to unwind and forgive this pain from our past. We all have it. We all have a story. Mine's no worse than anybody else's. I'm sharing it a little bit because maybe it's helpful. You hear me talk about some of the nuance. It could be helpful. Everyone's chart is a different way. Everyone approaches their situation differently. And there's strengths and there's benefit and weakness in all of it. You know, the benefit with me, with all the Gemini, is I was always trying to figure it out. I always kind of understood that you know, I was always trying to just understand it. And if I could understand the situation intellectually, then there's space for my compassion to come through. But it comes through because I can see them as just equals, as people who did their best. I'm another person doing my best. In fact, if I'd have been in your situation, I might have done worse. So I have space to move in that regard. That's how Gemini moves in their world, at best. When Gemini doesn't move well, it's because they don't understand what's going on. And then they get bogged down in emotion. For example, every sign has a way of connecting with that genius. And they're going to try to make it happen. So Gemini is going to try to be free somehow so that they can understand things. And that's the road to all of that compassion and forgiveness. Every sign has their own way of doing it. And what we're going to see with this transit of Jupiter through Scorpio is this great opportunity to revisit these, especially these rusty old chains of resentments that maybe have built up, these vulnerabilities, these situations that we couldn't control. This is a big trigger for Scorpio, is control. And you can even look at this like the control that your family has over you and the control you want to have over yourself as a result, and the control you exert on another to insulate yourself from the chaos and the disaster they could bring into your life. So you might do things to try to control them or to control a situation or get into little, again, the difficulty often with Scorpio is like a sort of passive aggressive way, not really communicating what the truth and what's clear, but using communication as little strategies, little games to, bait someone into doing something so you can then form some conclusion. And again, it can spiral. And again, I'm not just saying Scorpios. I'm saying that it's that part of the intellect that's suspicious and trying to make sure that if I do this, I'm not going to be too exposed, and then I won't be able to control the situation and all of that. This is what can make us just neurotic. Again, whether we have planets in Scorpio or not, it's that part of our psyche, that part of the universal consciousness. And so Jupiter going through that brings a great opportunity for our teachings and for us to learn and for us to evolve all of this potential darkness into the light. And again, the real sort of cachet, the real sort of place of expansion is in gratitude, being grateful that you're alive, grateful for grateful that anyone has ever done anything for you. I mean, literally, even just and especially like with our parents or with anyone who's been around us. Think of all they've done for you, not what they didn't do well. Isn't that the way you would want to be judged? Wouldn't you like to be judged for your best intentions rather than the things you've screwed up? Notice again how Scorpio is where we tend to judge people for the mistakes they've made and how knowingly or unknowingly they've hurt us. But again, this is a very myopic point of view, because they've probably done 10 to 1 good things for you. Like, I can focus on the things my father and my mother didn't do well, but their entire life revolved around giving me the best they could while they could. I've never made that kind of sacrifice for someone before. And I don't know if I would have done it anywhere near as well as they did. So again, it's very easy to look at the monstrous things some people may have done, especially those who were very close to you. But think of all the good they've done. And again, we don't forgive for them. You forgive people for you. Forgiveness benefits you. These are the kinds of breakthroughs that you have and you hear, especially around spiritual teachers and gurus. I'm blessed to have met my Satguru, my spiritual teacher, Amma, the hugging saint, who, of course, practices this in action, but also talks about these things so much that, we hang on to things and we hang on to grudges as if it's hurting the other person. I mean, it does. We know how to be cruel to another person by withholding our love and attention. The people that we love that hurt us, in trying to hurt them back, we withhold forgiveness from them, as if that actually hurts them more than it hurts us. Forgiveness is like the water flowing beautifully between two, poles of existence. Love is a flow. When one or both people are backed into a corner because of a grudge, they're both suffering. So forgiveness is not for the other person. You're not doing them a favor by forgiving them. You're doing yourself a favor first. And by the way, I'll just say this last thing, even with my father, because that's probably the easiest one to explain. After I started spending time with him again, after not seeing him when I was when I was a teenager, we had a couple blow-ups here and there. And at one point, I don't remember why it happened, but he started talking about when I was a kid and mistakes he made. And I'm glad for him that he said these things. I didn't ask him to say them, but I looked him right in the face and said, I forgive you, Dad. I appreciate you saying this, and I forgive you, and I love you, and I know you did the best you could do. I really do. And don't burden yourself with this anymore. I may have been mid-20s. I don't remember. And it was very healing to say that. And to some extent, it had some effect. But my father took that to his grave. Meaning, I could never have punished him as much as he punished himself. Which is the tragedy. And this is the tragedy when I think of my parents now, both of them. My father in particular, because I don't think he ever found happiness. My mother did. My father found peace, happiness on some level, but not the same. We didn't really talk the last several years of his life, not because of anything from the past in that regard, but it was the present. And just his nature was to be so, depressed about life and fearful, and he never got over his childhood, to put it bluntly. He still hated his father and still talked about things that happened to him when he was a kid. And he would say things to me like, you don't know what it was like to be raised by someone who acted that way. And a couple of times I reminded him, I'm like, Dad, I do, remember? And it was like, but at some point when you're in your 40s and you're, I didn't really visit, I didn't go back and visit so much just because I didn't. I lived in California, had this whole life, and my father was still in the life that he was in. I invited him. It was an open invitation to come visit San Francisco and to do something else. I was always encouraging him when we did talk to come out and visit and take a trip, just like my mom did. Like my mom came out and visited, and we became very good friends, very close as mother and son can be in the history that we had. We were very much at peace. I was also at peace with my father for his decisions, but we didn't talk the last several years. Again, it wasn't my decision. There was always an open invitation to come and visit and to do this, but I didn't go back and go sit. First of all, one of the reasons is his wife was angry at me and all. It was just, there was still so much drama that was enveloping his life. He was still in that thing that was just part of his life, which that's the tragedy. The tragedy has nothing to do with what happened to me. All of that is so old. That's why I can talk about it now. I only talk about it because I know that it's helpful to people. It's just because it helps us bond. It helps us relate. It's not like I'm sad about it or depressed about it. Of course, there's emotions about it because these things happened. But the sadness or the realization and the tragedy, which is also part of it, has nothing to do with the past. The past was let go a long time ago. It's the tragedy of what the person carried around in their life. In relation to me, a lot of it was still wrapped up in some of that guilt. And so the point is, I mention this because of forgiveness and compassion and trying to make sure that someone knows what they did. Everybody knows what they did. We know what we've done, particularly if it's something to loved ones. If someone doesn't have the pride to apologize back or something like that, this is always what the ego does. Well, how do I know that if I say sorry that they're going to reciprocate, or I don't want to be the only one saying anything? That's all. If that's the way it is, that's all ego. Then that's not compassion. You don't have to apologize. Forgiveness has nothing to do with getting anything. There's nothing reciprocal. It's forgiveness. It's just being okay, right? And again, you don't have to worry that they're not going to atone for their sins. You're not God. It's not up to you to make them atone for their sins. It's up to you to know yourself. Know thyself is why we're here. The more you know yourself, the more you have compassion for yourself, you have more compassion for your mistakes, and you have more compassion for others. And by the way, we tend to say this, especially in New Age circles, that, well, first we have to forgive ourselves. Let me be clear about something too. We have infinite compassion for ourselves. We forgive ourselves of everything. Now, we might carry guilt around, but underneath it all, people have, I've noticed, a pretty infinite amount of forgiveness for all the stuff they've done when it comes down to these kinds of situations. I often, even in readings, I have to remind people that, look, it was a two-way street. The relationship between you and any other person is a dynamic thing. It's not just one person. So Jupiter in Scorpio, very much about unwinding a lot of these deeper emotional triggers and hooks and vulnerabilities and evolving them and bringing them into a place of consciousness and wisdom where, if you're a spiritual person, you're studying astrology, you're studying these things, you have some Jupiter, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious, I'm this, I'm that, but you're still hanging out in all this resentment and paranoia and anger at everybody or people who've done things to you. You're not putting it into practice. I'll flat out say it. You're not putting it into practice. Putting it into practice is connecting to the truth of who you are, and from that place of clarity and truth and beauty flows nothing but forgiveness, compassion, that is not situational or transactional. It just becomes a part of who you are. And in a more literal sense, Jupiter in Scorpio brings us into this place of where our philosophies of Jupiter comes into that realm of Scorpio, which has a lot to do with meditation and the emotional discipline and the emotional courage to meditate and practice those spiritual teachings, bring them into practice, so that we unwind the places where we're emotionally stuck. Scorpio can be emotionally stuck. Instead, we're emotionally deep, sensitive, compassionate, and strong. So I know this is long. I hope that this helped you, and apologize if it seemed indulgent to talk about, my past or whatever. It seems appropriate because this is a lot of where our Scorpio stuff hangs out, and really trying to understand this area of life, why we're triggered, what makes us spin out and self-protective because of vulnerabilities, and then control situations and stay emotionally stuck. So I hope this was helpful. Share it with others.